So I have to share this. I overheard there was a family that came in and they went to the deacon. They said, you know, deacon, it's been a while since we've had all the kids together at Mass. Do you have any tips for making sure that, you know, they do what they need to do? And the deacon had a great response. He said, if they misbehave, just tell them they got to stay for the next Mass too. I bring that up why? When we see children at Mass, it signals something so important for any community of faith. It signals future. And we can't but rejoice at that. And so know that we're so overjoyed having you here with us. And you know I'm an identical twin, and so my twin brother and I were little terrors growing up. Like my mom, when she passes, is going to go straight to heaven. Poor woman, what we put her through. So I know what it's like to be a kid who's in the pew, moving around and shaking. Don't worry. We're just so happy to have you here with us. So I want to share a story. So a newly commissioned Army colonel, he had just moved into his new office, having taken a new position. A private, a soldier, low-ranking, he entered his office with a toolbox. So to impress this soldier, this private, the colonel, he said, you know, just wait a minute, soldier. I got a phone call that I really need to take. So he picks up the phone and he says, General, yes, it's you. Okay, how can I help? There was this dramatic pause. And then the colonel said, no problem. I'll phone Washington right away and talk to the president about it. I'll take care of it. And with that, he hung up the phone. He looks at the private and he says, okay, now son, what can I do for you? The private, he kind of shuffled around, you know, was a little embarrassed. And sheepishly he said, you know, sir, there's just a little thing that I came to address. I came to hook up your phone. Yeah, I got a question. Jack, I'm going to put you on the spot, okay? Why do we pray? What's that? We pray so that we can go to heaven. Anyone else? Why do we pray? Come on, you guys got something. Why do you pray? What do you think? Anyone else? Any of the little ones? Go ahead. What's that? We pray to Jesus. All right, you got it. Oh, to thank him for our world. To become a man of God. Is that what you said? All right. To let him know that we respect him. And how about we love him? Okay. But to stay closer to God, oh my gosh, I should just end right now, sit down, and just, that's it. To stay closer to God. I'm going to go into prayer, but it's something that I think I need to clarify in order for us to really understand what Jesus is saying in our gospel. So keep that in mind, what the purpose of prayer is, right? So Jesus in our gospel, he shares this parable, and he tells this story. So he tells this story about this Pharisee and a tax collector who are worshiping in the temple. Imagine the temple as the church. So the temple at the time was the place where the community gathered to worship God, just like we're doing right now. So who is a Pharisee? A Pharisee is kind of like, he would be like the scholar of the law, right? He's like, imagine like a priest. That's kind of like who the Pharisee is. He dressed like a priest. He taught about the faith. So you would expect that a Pharisee kind of knew what he was doing, right? Because he would teach others how to do it, how to pray, what the law was about. That's what a Pharisee is. And it's interesting because Jesus says that he imagines this situation with these two characters, and the Pharisee is at the front of the temple praying to God. And he offers the prayer, and we heard the prayer in the gospel. And then we hear about another character. We hear about the tax collector. And that's a really important detail. Because they're like a tax collector, we may not understand what the significance is. The tax collector was like one of the most hated people at the time. Like a tax collector was the type of person, if you saw them coming at you, walking down the street, you would cross the street just to avoid them. Because they worked for the Romans who were occupying that land. So the tax collector, as a Jew, worked for the enemy, and as working for the enemy would take money from the people when they came to pay their taxes. So like he was a really hated figure in the time. But it's interesting because we hear that he's praying in the back of the church. For Catholics, we love to sit in the back, right? Anytime you come into a church, automatically you go into the back. We can relate. Sitting in the back is at the time would signal someone who's further away from God. Imagine like that's where Jesus is in the tabernacle. You want to get as close as you can to him. The tax collector sat all the way in the back because that's where people expected him to be. And he just offers this very, very simple prayer. But Jesus brings up these two characters in opposition. Why does he do that? See, the Pharisee, we hear in offering his prayer, we hear that he spoke to himself, which is kind of interesting because he begins with the words, God, oh God, and he launches into this prayer. He says, good thing I'm not like that tax collector or like the cheater or the robber. I'm not like him or her. I follow the law. So he begins with, oh God, and he gives a litany of all the good things that he does, of how great he is. And Jesus says that he spoke this prayer to himself, which is kind of odd, right? Like you said, prayer is connecting with God. The reason we pray isn't so that we win the lottery, or that the Giants win, or that the Yankees pull one off, right? We don't pray for that. That's a very, very little or insignificant reason to pray. Ultimately, the reason why we pray is to connect with God. Because God is who gives us the strength to be who he calls us to be. So it's interesting how Jesus says in the Pharisee's prayer, he spoke this prayer to himself, meaning that he wasn't really speaking to God. He was more interested in telling God how great he was, not asking God for the grace to be the person he ought to be. Meanwhile, the tax collector, he recognizes how sinful he is. Like, man, he knows that he's in a really bad place. And he knows that he doesn't do the right thing. The most important thing he does is he says, God. What does he say? In his prayer, he tells him to have mercy on me, a sinner. Such a simple prayer. But it's a prayer that acknowledges who he is before God. So the secret to the tax collector's prayer is this. Two things. The first is this. Why was Jesus highlighting the tax collector's prayer? Yeah, humility, of course. That's really important to connect with God. Two things. The first is this. He tells God, have mercy on me, a sinner. As saying that to God, he's acknowledging who God is. God is the source of mercy. Do you know what mercy means? Got you. Do we know what I wasn't going to put you on the spot, all right? Do we know what mercy means? Mercy comes from a Latin word, misericordes. Miser, we know, miser means like wretched. Like a miserly person is a wretched, unhappy person. Cores means heart. So it's someone with a wretched heart. But to be merciful is to enter into that wretched heart and to take that wretchedness into your own heart. To be merciful is to embrace the person in their difficulty and imagine that, taking that person and placing them in your heart. That's exactly who God is. When he looks upon us, he sees our wretchedness, our difficulty as sinners, the challenges that we have, and the situations we often put ourselves in. And he embraces us and he places us in his heart. That's the first step. He recognizes who God was and is. The second secret to the tax collector's prayer is this. He recognizes that he needs God's mercy. And that makes all the difference. You see, I think oftentimes what prevents our relationship with God and even our active participation in the faith life and worship of God is that we don't really think we need him. At the end of the day, we think that we have it all within ourselves to establish that relationship with God. That we can bridge that gap on our own. But friends, that's not how we're made. That's why we need God. We need someone who can build that bridge, who can help us to enter into his loving heart. So in our lives, a wonderful reflection for us as we begin this week, do I see God as all merciful? And that doesn't mean that whatever I do, he's going to forgive. Yeah, kind of, but it's more than that. It's kind of like this. As a kid, right? You know, imagine you come home from school and maybe you got into a fight, or a friend of yours was treated poorly, or you saw something bad happen to an animal, or something devastating, and you want to share that with your parents. So like you're on the verge of tears, you're having a tough day, and you want to share that with your mom or with your dad or with your grandparents. Isn't it incredible when they respond with tenderness, and they're able to see you and hear what you're having to say, and it's almost like they embrace you as you're speaking to them. You feel like you're being heard. You feel like you're entering into their heart. That's what it means to be merciful. And friends, that's ultimately who God is. Do we see that in God? And in conclusion, do we see a need for God? Do I believe that I am missing something in my life that only God can give? So friends, are we the Pharisee who proclaims the good things we do? And in fact, I have to say this, the Pharisee was right. I mean, sometimes we give him too bad of a rap. He was a good man. He followed the letter of the law. He did what was expected of him. What went bad is how he looked at his relationship with God. He did everything he needed to do. What was misplaced in his life was his prayer with God. The tax collector was a bad man. He wasn't good. But at the end of the day, he understood and acknowledged his place before God. And more importantly, who God was in his life. We all have that opportunity in ours. So are we the Pharisee, or are we the tax collector?